The Colorado sky that morning was the color of a bruise that wouldn't heal. Purplish at the edges, gray dead center, the kind of sky that makes no promises and keeps its word about that. Below it, a woman stood at the edge of a dirt road with everything she owned in one hand. Behind her, a gate that had just latched shut. In front of her, 40 miles of mountain country where men went to disappear. She didn't run, she didn't cry, she walked north. 3 miles into the rocks, she found blood on the stone, fresh, a drag mark. Then a handprint pressed into the dust at the height of a man who could no longer stand. She should have kept walking. She didn't. What she found in those rocks would cost her everything she had left and force the most powerful man in the county to answer for 12 years of lies in front of every soul in Redstone Crossing. But first she had a wounded man to keep alive and a war she didn't know yet she was already in. The Colorado sky that morning was the color of a bruise that wouldn't heal. Purplish at the edges, gray dead center. The kind of sky that doesn't make promises and keeps its word about that at least. Mae Calloway was 20 years old, and she was standing in the yard behind the house, with her hands still wet from the wash when her father came through the back door with his hat in his hands. Earl Calloway walked slow, the way a man walks when the decision is already made and his body just needs to catch up to it. Margaret followed 3 steps behind, wiping her hands on her apron. Clean hands, nothing on them. She wiped them anyway. Mae didn't turn around right away. She'd learned early that if you didn't look at trouble coming, you could sometimes control what your face did when it arrived. So she kept her back to them and finished wringing out the shirt in the wash bucket and listened to the particular quality of her father's footsteps on frozen ground. He stopped 6 feet away. Mae. She turned around. Earl was holding a bundle wrapped in floral sacking cloth. Her things, her good dress, the one with the blue collar she'd sewn herself last April. Her grandmother's thimble, silver and dented on one side from years of actual use, and $3 she'd kept tucked under the floorboard by the east window. $1 at a time since October, for reasons she hadn't fully named yet but had known she would need. He'd found it, or he'd looked for it. She didn't know which was worse and didn't have the energy right now to decide. She let the rag fall back into the wash water. "Tell me what this is." Earl looked at the bundle instead of her face. "Harlan Voss came to see me. There it was. He says if you leave the county before sundown today, he'll mark the debt settled. All of it, 40 years of it. Not 8, 40, which meant her father had been carrying this longer than she'd understood. Had been carrying it quietly in the space behind his eyes all through her childhood, while she'd been growing up in that house, thinking it was just a house, and not a thing being held over their heads by a man with 40,000 acres and patience to match. She stood very still. Not because she was calm, because she was running the calculation. Every version of this conversation she might have rehearsed with herself at 2 a.m. in the dark of her room, deciding which version was actually true. "How long have you known he'd ask for this?" Earl's mouth opened, closed. "How long, Papa? He mentioned it last month." Earl finally looked at her. His eyes were red at the rims. She didn't know if that was grief or the cold morning air and didn't think it mattered much either way. "I told him no. I said no, Mae. You have to believe that. But then he sent men out to count the cattle. And there was a question raised about the boundary line on the south field. And you changed your mind." Silence. Not the thinking kind. The kind where the thinking is already done and can't be taken back. Mae looked at her mother. Margaret was staring at a point somewhere near the base of the fence post, lips moving slightly. Praying or working up to something she'd already decided not to say. Either way, she wasn't going to be useful right now, and Mae had known that before she looked. "I'm not going to beg." Mae said it the way she said things she meant, without decoration. "I'm not going to cry in front of you, but I want you to hear me say it plain." She picked up the bundle from where Earl had set it on the fence post. It was light, pathetically light. 20 years of being someone's daughter, and it fit in a piece of flour sacking. "What you're doing right now is not about the debt. The debt is just the story you're telling yourself so you can sleep." Earl's jaw went tight. "You're trading me because you're afraid of him and you don't know another way out. That's your land and your debt, and I suppose it's your right." She tucked the bundle under her arm. "But don't you tell yourself it was about the debt. Don't you do that to yourself." She put on her boots. The left one had a split seam along the toe she'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. She hadn't gotten to it because she'd assumed she had more time. She stopped thinking about that entirely. Margaret made a sound. Half word, half nothing. Mae walked out the front gate. She heard the latch click behind her, and she did not turn around, and the meadowlark somewhere up on the ridge was going through its whole song like it had absolutely no idea what kind of morning this was. Redstone Crossing had maybe 200 souls on its best day. On its worst day, it had all 200 of them out where they could watch you. That was the particular cruelty of small Colorado Territory towns in 1879. Everyone knew your business before you knew it yourself. The general store, the livery, the single church with the bell that needed rehanging, the saloon that kept shorter hours than it used to since the previous deputy before Pruitt had gotten shot in it 3 years back. All of it strung along Main Street like beads on a wire, close enough that sound traveled end to end when the wind was right. Mae kept her head level, eyes forward, shoulders back, the walk of a woman who has somewhere to be even when she doesn't, especially when she doesn't. She was passing the gap between the feed store and the land office when she heard the horses, 4 of them, coming up from the south end of Main Street at a pace that said this wasn't social. Harlan Voss rode the black horse. He always rode the black horse. 16 hands and the temperament of its owner, outwardly controlled with something working underneath that you did not want to test. 2 riders flanked him. A third brought up the rear on a gray mare. All of them wearing the flat-brimmed hats that Voss's ranch hands favored, the kind of hat that functioned as a uniform without technically being one. They stopped in front of the deputy's office. Mae slowed. Not stopped. Stopped would be noticed. She drifted toward the edge of the boardwalk and found a reason to be interested in the seed packet display in the feed store window, which she had no intention of buying anything from. Wade Pruitt came out of the deputy's office. Badge on his chest like an afterthought, silver catching the flat winter light. He had the face of a man who had wanted to be friendly at some point and had learned it wasn't useful, which gave him the permanent expression of someone arguing with himself about something and losing on a regular basis. He said something to Voss that Mae couldn't catch from this distance. Voss leaned down from the saddle unhurried. The way men lean when they've never had to hurry because the world rearranges itself around them before they need to ask. The families along the river are dragging their feet. His voice carried in the cold air with the flat certainty of a man stating weather. They need something to push them along. Not raised, not commanding. The tone of expectation. The tone of a man who has told the weather what temperature he prefers and found that it generally complies. Pruitt nodded. Once, twice. The nod of a man whose neck had grown accustomed to the motion. Then Voss said something lower. Mae caught her father's name. Caught the word settled. Caught the specific texture of satisfaction in Voss's voice, the particular sound of a man who has moved a piece on a board and watched it land exactly where he intended. And the Garrett situation. Voss straightened in the saddle, already looking north, already moving to the next item on his list. Handle it this week, Wade. Not next week. Pruitt said something Mae couldn't hear. I don't want to hear about terrain. Voss's horse shifted and he adjusted his weight without looking down. The reflex of someone who has sat a horse so long the animal is just an extension of thought. This week, he rode on. The 3 men followed. Nobody looked at Mae. She was a transaction that had been completed, a line item, an account cleared and filed. Something went cold in her chest. Not the burning thing she'd expected. Cold, clean, specific. Like well water in January that shocks you because you didn't understand how thirsty you were until it made contact. She turned away from the seed packets and kept walking north. She had a bundle and $3 and a pair of boots with a split seam. She had nowhere to sleep tonight and no one waiting for her, and a county that had been quietly informed without any formal announcement to let her go. Voss didn't need to threaten people individually. He just needed to make clear that his protection extended to those who cooperated, and everyone else understood the implication without needing it explained. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew standing on opposite ends of Main Street on a gray Colorado morning, was that Mae Calloway was about to follow for a trail of blood into the rocks north of town and make a decision that would begin undoing 12 years of his most careful work. But that came later. First came the walking. The road north out of Redstone Crossing turned to packed dirt within a mile and to loose rock within 2. Scrub oak thickened on either side. The elevation climbed almost immediately. The kind of gradual ascent you don't register for the first hour, and then suddenly your legs are burning, and you understand you've been working much harder than you thought. The cold was specific. Not the damp cold of lower ground, but the dry cold of altitude, the kind that gets into the spaces between things and stays there. Mae's breath came out in short, even clouds. She set a pace she could maintain and didn't push past it. $3 in a flour sack and a split seam in her left boot. Those were the facts. She worked with facts. She'd been walking for just under 3 hours when she saw it. The blood on the rock wasn't dramatic, not a pool, not the kind of scene that announces itself. It was a drag mark, a dark smear across the flat face of a sandstone ledge where something large had passed through at a speed slower than walking. and 3 feet beyond it, a handprint, not them. Pressed into the dust at the rock's edge with the fingers slightly blurred, the way a print looks when the person making it is leaning rather than choosing. When the hand is there because it needs to be there, and not because anyone decided to put it there. She knew she should keep moving. She knew it the way she knew the split seam in her left boot would let the cold in eventually, practically, specifically, without drama attached. Keep walking north. Don't follow blood on rocks. Don't go toward trouble when you've just gotten clear of one specific variety of it. Except the handprint sat at the height of someone sitting, not standing, and the drag marks deepened in a pattern that spoke of managed weight rather than simply carried weight, of a body distributing load with deliberate care, because a wrong step here cost more than it would somewhere else. And because she could not have explained this to anyone's satisfaction. Something in the pattern reminded her of the way her father had walked across the yard that morning. The movement of a person getting through something they have absolutely no choice but to get through. She went 40 yards into the scrub, threading between boulders that the creek had moved down from the ridge sometime before anyone in this territory was counting years. The shadows deepened. The rock walls narrowed into something that wasn't quite a shelter and wasn't quite a cave, just an overhang and 2 large stones creating 3 sides of a room, the kind of hollow a deer would use on a bad night. He was sitting against the far stone with his back to the rock and his right side toward her, and then his eyes opened. The gun was in his hand before she'd fully registered that she was seeing a man, not drawn. It had been there already, resting against his thigh, and what changed was the angle. The barrel came up, not fast, but certain, the way a compass needle finds north, without effort or hesitation, because that's what compass needles do. Mae stopped, both hands came up. Open, don't. She looked at him, because, looking what you did with new information, enormous. That was the first word that arrived, and she couldn't move past it for a moment. Not tall the way men in saloons called each other tall. Not large the way men who did heavy work got large. This was something else. Something that had its own category. 6.5 feet or near enough that the difference didn't matter. Shoulders wide as a door frame. The kind of build that would have looked carved directly from the landscape he was sitting in if it weren't for the blood soaking through the strips of dark cloth tied around his right side. His face was sun-darkened and bearded, 4 or 5 days of it, covered in the specific mixture of dust and dried sweat that comes from moving hard and sleeping rough. Black hair pressed flat against his forehead. And his eyes, when they settled on her face, were dark and doing the rapid assessment she recognized because she'd been doing the same thing all morning. Running scenarios, checking angles, deciding what this situation actually was. She watched him decide she was alone, saw him decide she wasn't armed, saw him keep the gun where it was anyway because deciding those things and trusting those things were not the same operation. I'm not here to hurt you. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, and she was grateful for that small mercy. I followed the blood on the rocks. He watched her. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, not hidden. She could watch it happening, the weighing of risk against the very real and pressing problem of his right side, which was not a theoretical problem. The cloth around it was dark in the way that cloth gets when it has been dark for hours. You're losing too much. She kept her hands up. Her eyes went to the makeshift bandage and came back to his face. How long ago? Nothing. I know, Ruth Kinney. She took a half step forward and his arm tensed and she stopped. The woman who does midwifing in Redstone Crossing. I've watched her work more times than I can count. I know what I'm looking at, and I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not going back to town to report anything. I need you to let me see what I'm dealing with. The calculation ran behind his eyes. She could see him weighing the risk of her against the very certain math of the wound. A man who has been holding himself together through conscious effort rather than physical reserves knows at some point that the effort is running out. Cabin. His voice came out rough, like something that hadn't been used regularly. 1/4 mile east. But not the gun either. Getting him to the cabin took 20 minutes and used more of Mae than she'd anticipated. She'd registered his size in the theoretical way you register a fact you've been told, and then his weight came against her shoulder, and the theoretical became entirely concrete. He set each foot with the deliberate precision of someone who understood the cost of a bad step here was different from the cost of a bad step somewhere else. But she felt the pressure change between the first 100 yards and the last. More of him by the end. Drawing on reserves that were getting thin, the cabin was small. A trapper's structure or something built when the silver claim 2 miles north was still someone's hope. Dry inside, a shelf with rusted tins, a water barrel with about 6 inches remaining. An old blanket on a wooden frame that had lost one leg and leaned at an angle against the wall. The ceiling was low. Boone Garrett had to angle himself through the door, and once inside, the space reorganized around him in a way that had nothing to do with threat. It was physics. A man of that size in a room that small changed what the room was. The proportions shifted them. Mae was not a small woman, and she felt the cabin's dimensions differently with him in it. The way you feel a room differently when a large piece of furniture has been moved in. She settled him against the wall with the best light from the single window falling on his right side. He allowed it. That allowance told her more than anything else about where he'd traveled from where this morning started. She used her own knife to cut away the improvised bandage. Small knife, sharp. She kept it sharp because a dull knife was more dangerous than no knife when precision was what you needed. The wound underneath was deep and clean-edged in the way only blades produce, not a bullet. She'd learned the difference from listening to Ruth describe injuries the way Ruth described everything, in the flat instructional tone of someone who had long ago decided that knowledge was more useful than squeamishness. This was a knife wound, tracking from the floating rib downward, and stopping short of anything that would have been fatal more quickly. It had been bleeding for hours, not catastrophically. Nothing vital opened, but steadily, the kind of steady that adds up. This needs stitching. She didn't frame it as a question because it wasn't one. She started going through her bundle with her free hand, taking inventory. Then she remembered something Ruth had said once. In the offhand way, Ruth said things that turned out to be essential. Fishing line, stronger than thread, holds better under rough conditions. Saddlebag. Her eyes moved to the leather bag he'd been carrying. Rolled line, left inside pocket. She found it. Found a small steel flint beside it. A folded piece of leather that weather had turned into something unreadable. A handful of jerked beef wrapped in canvas. She built a fire from the scrap wood stacked inside the door. Heated the knife blade. Boiled water in the tin cup from the shelf. Ran the fishing line through the hot water 3 times and let it sit. This is going to hurt. She said it because he deserved to know. Not because the warning would change anything. Everything hurts them. He said it without self-pity. That was the part that was almost harder to hear than if he'd said it with some. The flatness of it, factual. Like pointing at an overcast sky and naming the color gray, like pain had become such a consistent condition that variation in its degree no longer applied. She worked fast and as carefully as fast permitted. 14 stitches. Her hands trembled on the 4th one. Not from fear but from the specific strain of doing something that requires absolute precision, while simultaneously trying not to cause more damage than necessary. She got past the trembling. She kept her breathing even, and she watched the needle, and she did not think about anything except the needle. He made no sound throughout. His hands closed on his thighs. On stitch 7 his jaw set in a way that pulled the muscles of his neck taut, and it stayed that way until she tied off the last knot. Not a sound. She bandaged the wound with strips from the bottom of her extra shirt, not clean by any clinical measure but cleaner than what had been there before, and tight enough to matter. She sat back on her heels. Her arms were shaking faintly and she didn't have the energy to pretend otherwise. Your name. He looked at her for a moment that had weight in it. Boone Garrett. The name arrived like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone within 50 miles knew it. Boone Garrett. The man on the mountain. The one Wade Pruitt had been tasked with locating. The one Voss's men had ridden out after on 3 separate occasions in the past year, and returned from short 2 horses and long on vague accounts about difficult terrain and fog and the particular unreliability of mountain country. The ghost of Boulder Break that people in Redstone Crossing mentioned when explaining why the North Creek was the boundary you didn't cross. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who has watched people recognize his name before and knows precisely which direction that recognition runs. I'm Mae Calloway. She held his gaze. Before you do whatever you're about to do with your face, I should tell you that this morning my father traded me to pay a debt to the man I'm betting is responsible for that wound. So I'm not currently positioned to be sympathetic to whatever Harlan Voss wants this county to think about you. Something shifted in his expression. Not enough to name easily, but something moved. Voss's men. He confirmed it the way he seemed to confirm most things, choosing words the way you choose footing on loose shale. 3 of them came up to the North Face 2 days ago. Wasn't their first visit. I gathered that. How many went back to him? 2. She nodded that. He's already got Pruitt looking. I heard Voss on Main Street this morning telling Pruitt the River families need something to push them. He said the Garrett situation needed handling this week. Boone looked at the door and then back at her. The assessment she'd seen before was running again, but differently now. She was no longer part of the threat calculation. She had moved into a different column. "Why are you telling me this?" She set the larger portion of the jerked beef on the floor in front of him. Kept the smaller portion for herself because she was also going to need to eat today, and she wasn't performing generosity, she was doing math. "Because this morning I was told my only option was to walk away and let other people decide what happened to everything around me." She met his eyes. "I don't accept that, and you're bleeding. And the most useful thing I can do right now is give you both pieces of information at once." He looked at the beef, looked at her, a long pause with genuine weight in it. "Ruth Kinney." He said it like he was confirming a location on a map. "She knows you. She's the one who first told me about fishing line. 30 years she's been keeping this county functional while the men argue about whether to import a doctor. 32 she'd tell you, and she'd be precise about it." Something at the corner of his mouth moved. The ghost of a muscle memory for something that had once been easier. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold, finding its way through the cabin's gaps. "You need to sleep. I need to get back to the edge of town before dark for proper supplies. I'll come back." He looked at her steadily. "You'll come back." Not skeptical. Flatter than skeptical. The register of a man who has reorganized his expectations around the probability of people not coming back and has stated this as simple fact rather than accusation. "I'll come back. Is there somewhere better than this? Harder to find," he thought for a moment. "Silver Creek Mine. North and east 3 miles. Hard climb but 3 exits and you can see the valley approach from the main shaft. I know where it is." He watched her at the door. "You didn't ask why they're after me." She turned back. "Everyone in the county knows the story Voss tells." She looked at him steadily. "I don't have a reason to accept his version over yours. When I come back, if you want to tell me the real one, I'm listening." She went out into the afternoon light before he could respond to that. Ruth Kinney's house sat at the south end of Redstone Crossing, where the street became a track, and the track became a suggestion. Low adobe, a red cloth on the door, a signal Mae had grown up understanding without being told. Births and illness tended to within. A place that existed slightly outside the town's social jurisdiction because Ruth's skills made her too valuable to subject to its rules. Mae went around to the back. Ruth opened the kitchen door before Mae reached it. She always did that, Lord Child. Ruth stepped back to let her in. She was broad and had gone silver at the temples and treated that as practical information rather than anything requiring a response. Her hands were flour-dusted. Her expression said she'd already worked out most of this situation and was waiting for the person at the center of it to arrive so they could get on with things. "I heard about this morning before you'd gotten a mile out. Dorothy at the market, 7 o'clock. Ruth had filled tin can up from the water pail and set it on the table without ceremony. Mae sat and drank them. The water tasted of iron and cold stone and was the best thing she'd had all day. "I need wound supplies." She set the cup down. "Arnica if you have it. Clean linen if you can spare any." Ruth's eyes went still in the way of someone who has just received a piece of information that reorganizes the shape of things. Not alarmed. Ruth didn't do alarmed. Attentive in the specific way of someone who has just been handed a piece that changes the shape of the puzzle. Whose wound? Someone who needed help and didn't have anyone else providing it. Ruth. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Ruth was the only person who had never required Mae to be anything other than what she was. And Mae felt the full specific weight of that now, having spent a morning being reminded what it felt like when people did require it. There are men in town. Ruth turned to the back shelf and began moving jars with the efficiency of long practice. "Came in last evening. 2 of Voss's hands and a third I don't recognize. They've been asking questions about the Boulder Break area." She didn't turn around. "Wade Pruitt's been with them since this morning." Mae's hands tightened around the empty cup. "Voss raised the reward this week." Ruth came back to the table with a small cloth bundle and set it down. "Arnica yarrow. A small jar of honey, clean linen strips. $200. That's near half a year's wages for most men working this county." Which is exactly what it's meant to be. Enough that men who wouldn't ordinarily consider it will do arithmetic they're not proud of. She paused. "There's something else." "Agnes Stoll, she works Voss's house, has done for 15 years. She came by 2 days ago. She had something she wanted to say to someone. I told her to wait because I didn't know what she'd be saying it into." Ruth's eyes met Mae's. "I think that's changed." Mae stood and tucked the bundle into her bag. "Can you get word to Silas Crane when he's next through?" Ruth studied her with the specific attention she gave to things that mattered. "What kind of word?" "Tell him there's work, the kind he does. 3 copies of whatever I bring him." She held Ruth's gaze. "And tell him the man who owes him from 74 may be about to have some significant legal difficulties." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once. The nod of a woman who has assessed a structure and decided it will hold. You need to be careful. Mae, careful isn't going to cover it, I know. Voss has been operating this way for 12 years. Men who've been doing something that long develop a particular talent for making it continue. Then we find what stops it. The mine on Silver Creek. It still has 3 exits. Ruth looked at her steadily. Last I knew, come back safe. A pause and Mae, whatever you're deciding, make sure it's a decision and not a reaction to this morning. Mae walked out into the late afternoon. The shadows on Main Street were long, the sun dropping toward the ridge, and she moved quickly because she had a 3-mile climb ahead of her and she'd promised to be back before dark. She was nearly clear of the south end when she slowed. The voices coming through the open side door of the saloon were not being kept quiet. Man killed one of Voss's hands with his bare hands. That's what Pruitt said. I heard it was a blade. I heard both. Doesn't matter. Point is Voss wants him found and he's putting up 200 to do it. A low sound from the second voice. That's more than a winter. That's a winter and a horse besides. Mae kept walking. Didn't change her pace. Her face did nothing. Her feet kept their rhythm until she'd turned north at the end of Main Street, and the last buildings of Redstone Crossing had thinned out behind her. $200. Anyone helping him shares his situation. She walked faster. She needed to move Boone out of that cabin before morning. She needed to reach him before Voss's men widened their search past the first ridge. She stopped that line of thought and organized it. What she needed right now was to get back to the cabin before dark. Everything else could sequence from there. The sun was 3 fingers above the ridge when she reached the cabin door. Boone was awake. He'd moved himself to face the entrance, which she could tell by the disturbed dust on the floor, and had the gun resting on his thigh again. His color was marginally better, not good, marginally better, which was above the bar of where he'd been. He'd eaten the jerked beef, all of it, which was the right choice. She came in and set Ruth's bundle down and started unwrapping without preamble. We have a problem, start with the largest. Voss's men have been in town since yesterday and they're asking specifically about the Boulder Break area. She found the arnica and began preparing a poultice against the tin cup. Someone saw me go north this morning. If they're methodical and Voss doesn't hire 4 people who aren't, they'll start checking the shelters and cabins along the first ridge by tomorrow at the latest. Boone watched her hands work. The mine is 3 miles, I know. Ruth confirmed it has 3 exits. She paused. She knew about it before I asked. Something that approached warmth moved through his voice. Minimal, but present. Different when it's directed at you, though. She smoothed the new bandage into place. He was still through all of it, the particular stillness of someone who has made a complete decision about allowing a thing to happen and committed to that decision without reservation. No flinching, no commentary, no performance. Voss raised it to 200, she said. Nothing in his expression changed, which was itself an answer about how many times he'd already processed the fact of a price on his name. That's not the piece that matters most. She continued working. What matters is what I heard him tell Pruitt this morning. The families along the river need something to push them. He's not just hunting you, he's using the hunt. Using the fear of you to move people off water rights he wants. She looked at him directly. I want to understand what that looks like from where you've been standing. Boone was quiet for a moment. Outside the wind had come up, moving through the cabin's gaps and stirring the ash in the cold side of the fireplace. Then he began. 3 years on Boulder Break. Didn't come down, didn't bother anyone. Trapped, moved around, stayed north of the creek. His hands were loose on his knees, open in the way of someone speaking honestly, which she noted because she'd watched those same hands close during the stitching. First 6 months, nobody paid attention. 7th month, a family named Pierce lost a grain supply from an outbuilding. Pruitt wrote it up and asked if I'd seen anything. I hadn't. He filed it as unknown. Mae felt the shape of what was coming before he said it. Month later, Kellerman's fence line on the North River branch was torn up, cattle scattered. Pruitt came out again. Started suggesting it could have been me. A pause. Kellerman sold to Voss the following week. Said the area had become too dangerous to work. 6 months after that, the Lester family on the North Branch, their barn went up. Middle of the night, nobody hurt but everything in it gone. Frank Lester came to me after them. Climbed up to where I was camped and told me he'd seen men coming from the south, not from the mountain. Said one of them wore a hat he recognized as belonging to one of Voss's riders, but he left anyway. His wife was expecting their 2nd child. He said he couldn't risk staying. Boone's eyes came back to Mae's face, but he told me what he saw before he went. She let that sit. She was building the full structure of it in her head, the complete shape, the logic of it. No one believed him because by then everyone was already living inside the story Voss had made about you. By then I was the story. It's easier to believe a story you've already accepted than to look at who profits from it being believed. Did you know it was staged, the attacks? I suspected within the first year. When Pruitt's men came for me the third time in 8 months, I stopped suspecting. His jaw tightened briefly. I defended myself. Same as the first 2 times. Same as 2 days ago. And this time one of them didn't come back. He noticed that she didn't. She saw the small recalibration of something in how he looked at her after them. All right, she stood, began repacking the bundle. Can you make 3 miles uphill? I can make 3 miles. She picked up her bundle. He took his saddlebag. At the door he paused. Why? Not a question with a specific answer expected. Something more foundational. The word of a man who had been trained by accumulated experience to expect a motive behind apparent generosity and genuinely could not locate one here that he recognized. She thought about it honestly. Not the fast answer, the real one. Because this morning I learned I was something that could be handed over. She said it looking at the door, not at him. I don't believe that's what I am, and the only way to prove it, not to anyone else, to myself, is to not do the same thing when I have the choice not to. She pushed the door open. The night air came in cold and carrying the smell of pine and coming frost. Come on. We go east first to break the track, then north. He stood in the doorway a moment, then he stepped through it. Above Boulder Break the stars were out in the numbers that a town's lamplight never let you see properly, and below them 2 people moved north through the scrub oak at the careful, unhurried pace of those who have somewhere to be and only one way to get there. Mae didn't look back at the cabin. She had her grandmother's thimble in her coat pocket, and $3 she hadn't spent and a direction that was forward. Forward was the only thing available. The mine smelled like old earth and cold mineral and time. Not unpleasant, just ancient. The smell of a place that had been doing its own work long before people arrived with lamps and ambitions and would go right back to it after they left them. Boone moved through the space with the focused attention of someone mapping it against future need. Not hurried, methodical. He checked the first side tunnel with one hand on the wall, checked the second, located the third exit near the rear where the rock had fractured along a natural seam. Wide enough for a man of ordinary dimensions to walk through straight. For a man of his dimensions it required turning sideways and exhaling, and he registered this without comment, filed it. Because 3 exits that required negotiation were still 3 exits. His right side was costing him. She could read it in how he held his right arm fractionally higher than necessary, compensating without deciding to. But he didn't acknowledge it, and she didn't name it yet. There was an order to things. She built the fire deep in the shaft in the natural depression where the rock widened into a room-sized chamber. Small fire. The draft moved through the mountain from below, which meant smoke dispersed through the upper fissures rather than signaling their location from outside. She'd noticed the air movement on the walk-in and filed it. Boone settled against the east wall. She'd seen enough to understand that he chose positions the way he chose everything, not randomly. The east wall held warmth better than the others. He knew that. 3 years on this mountain had given him a knowledge of it that went beyond observation into something closer to fluency. They split what remained of the food. He didn't argue about the division. The fire settled into a steady rhythm. Outside, the Colorado night pressed against the mountain, and the mountain held its ground. You know this mine. Not a question. I grew up 15 miles south. When you're 13 with nothing useful to do, you make geographically questionable decisions. She pulled her coat tighter. I also know that the creek running below it feeds into the Pierce property, and then the Kellerman land and curves east toward where the Lester family's boundary used to be before it reaches the main river. He looked at her. The water source. If you control the upper reach of that creek, you control everything downstream. Every family you named, every piece of land Voss has been working to acquire. He was quiet for a moment. He's been trying to buy the North Bank water rights for 4 years and failing because the families there hold rights that predate any of his claims. Until they get frightened enough to walk away. There it was. The complete shape of the thing. Not a story about a dangerous man in the mountains. A story about water and land and a man who needed a different story to make people abandon both. He needed something to scare them. Mae said it quietly. Something that wasn't him and couldn't be traced back to him. Something the county would accept as reason enough for people to leave. And I was already there. Boone said it without bitterness. Just the flat recognition of a man accounting for how he'd been used. Inconvenient to explain, easy to blame. I've been working out the shape of it for 2 years. Didn't have the pieces to prove it. Just the pattern and the timing and the knowledge that the men who came up after me weren't acting on their own initiative. Mae added a piece of wood to the fire. The light jumped and resettled. Then we find the pieces. He looked at her across the fire. You're already planning. I've been planning since Main Street. She met his eyes and held them. Someone inside Voss's operation has seen things. Someone who moves through that house invisibly enough that no one thought to stop saying things in front of them. She thought about what Ruth had said about Agnes Dole. Kept that to herself for now because it wasn't hers to give until she'd heard it directly. And there's a man in this county who told you what he saw, and he'll tell it again if the right person asks him the right way. Boone looked at the fire left. His brother didn't. Thomas Lester is still here. Works at the livery on the south end. Boone was quiet for a moment. You didn't know that before tonight. I don't come down. I know. She said it without judgment. That's going to have to change. The silence after that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people sitting with a true thing that neither of them was going to pretend was easy. After a while he reached into the saddlebag and took out a short piece of wood and a small knife. He began to work. What are you making? He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to let the question go. A horse. She watched his hands. The careful, deliberate movement of them. More precise than the object's size required. Rebecca loved horses. He said it looking at the wood. She knew every horse in this county she could get close enough to observe. Had names for all of them. Mae looked at the shape beginning to emerge from the grain of the wood. Forelegs taking form, the neck beginning to lift. She said nothing else because some things don't need a response. They need to be witnessed and then allowed to continue. Outside the mine, the Colorado mountains were doing what they always did, holding their ground against the dark with the complete indifference of things that have been doing it long enough to have forgotten there was anything difficult about it. And inside, the fire gave it small light. And the rough shape of a horse turned slowly in large careful hands. And Mae Calloway sat with a direction that was forward, and a set of problems that were solvable, and the specific knowledge that she had not yet done the most useful thing she was capable of doing. That came tomorrow. Tonight was enough. Mae went down to Redstone Crossing the following night. She'd turned it over through most of the day, running the risk against the alternative the way you run a fence line to find where it's weak. The risk was clear and nameable. A woman seen going north twice in 2 days, with Voss's men already asking questions about the Boulder Break area, with Pruitt stationed at the deputy's office and 2 strangers drinking at the saloon and watching the street between swallows. But the alternative was waiting. And while she waited, Agnes Dole was sitting on 15 years of evidence with nowhere to put it, losing a little confidence in it every day that no one came to hear it. Evidence was not a stable thing when it lived only inside one person's memory. It eroded. It began to seem smaller than it was. It started to feel like maybe the timing was wrong, maybe it wasn't enough, maybe the cost was too high. Mae had watched that happen to people before. She was not going to let it happen to Agnes Dole. She went around the south side of town through the dry creek bed behind the tannery and came up against the back of Ruth Kinney's property. Red cloth was down. She knocked on the kitchen side. Ruth opened before the second knock, lamp in hand, the expression of a woman who had already organized her thinking around this visit and was waiting for the person at the center of it to arrive so they could get on with things. Inside at the kitchen table sat a woman Mae didn't recognize. Middle-aged, narrow through the shoulders. Hands that told their own story before she opened her mouth, palms thickened at the base of each finger, knuckles reddened in the permanent way of someone who had done waterwork for decades, washing, wringing, scrubbing them. She sat with those hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the table, holding herself in the practiced compactness of someone who had learned that occupying less space was a form of protection. Ruth set the lamp down. Mae Calloway, Agnes Dole. Agnes looked up. Her eyes were careful with the specific patience of someone who had observed a great many things over a long stretch of years and made the professional judgment to stay quiet about most of them. You work for Voss. Mae sat across from her for Voss. Agnes's voice was quiet the way still water is quiet, not soft, not weak, something underneath it that didn't disturb easily. 15 years, washing, heavy cleaning, setting the table when he has guests. She paused. People stop seeing you after about the 3rd year. You become part of the furniture of the place. Mae understood that without needing it spelled out. Ruth says you have something. Mae kept her voice even, nothing pressing in it. You don't push a lamp that's burning low. I'm not going to force anything from you, but I'm here and I'm listening. Agnes looked at her hands. The silence stretched, and Mae let it stretch because this was not a moment fulfilling 8 weeks ago. Agnes began. First week of November. I was still up past midnight with a bad tooth, couldn't settle. Her hands turned over in her lap, palms up, then back down again. I saw 3 men leave from the south bar, not regular hands, different clothes. Rougher, them. Heavy coats, wide-brimmed hats pulled low, and they were carrying torches. Mae went very still. I watched from my room window. They rode south and cut east toward the river properties. Agnes's jaw tightened the first break in the surface. Morning came. Pruitt rode in before breakfast. He and Voss were in the study for close to an hour. When Pruitt left, Voss came out in the best mood I'd seen him in months. She met Mae's eyes directly for the first time. I heard Pierce's name through the study door. I heard Garrett 3 separate times. And Voss said, Clearly enough that I was certain, he said, That ought to do it for the holdouts. The kitchen stove ticked twice in the silence that followed. Pierce sold within 2 weeks, Mae said it quietly. I served the paperwork at dinner. Agnes's mouth compressed. Voss brought out the good wine, the cabinet he keeps locked, the kind that only appears when something has gone exactly the way he intended. Not general good humor. Satisfaction about a particular outcome. Was that the only time? No, flat. No hesitation. I can place 3 separate nights in the past 7 months that follow the same pattern. Men leaving late. Pruitt appearing the following morning. Voss pleased in a way that had a specific texture to it, and each time something happened on the river properties. Each time afterward, people in town talked about what the man in the mountains had done. The man in the mountains, Boone's name used the way you'd use a weather event. Something that happened to people rather than something done by a person with reasons and a history and a wife who had loved horses. There's more. Agnes said it into a silence Mae hadn't tried to fill. Smaller things, the way Voss talks about the families along the creek. Not as people making decisions about their own land, as pieces that haven't moved to their correct positions yet. She looked at the table. I heard him say once about the Garrett removal in '75. He said it had cleared a nuisance. Her jaw worked. I have thought about that word for 3 years. Mae did not reach for anything to soften that with. Agnes had carried that word for 3 years. She was entitled to set it down somewhere and have it witnessed without someone arriving immediately to redirect the weight of it. Will you say this in front of a licensed clerk? Put your name to it in writing. The pause was not hesitation. It was a person applying genuine intelligence to a decision that had real consequences in both directions. Yes, Agnes said it clean. I'll put my name on it. Ruth set 2 cups on the table without comment. Agnes wrapped her hands around hers. Mae did the same and let the warmth of it hold her for one breath. The specific gravity of something ordinary when everything around it was moving fast. She walked back up to the mine in the dark, carrying Ruth's answer and Agnes's testimony and the full weight of what she now understood. The cold had dropped sharper than the night before. She could smell the coming frost in it, that mineral edge that preceded the first real freeze of the season. Boone was awake. He'd moved the finished horse to the rock ledge beside him while she was gone, 4 legs planted on the granite, neck up, facing the entrance. He looked up when she came in, read her face the way he read everything, and went back to the fire. She sat across from him and got her breath back. Agnes Dole, 15 years in Voss's house. She watched 3 separate groups of his men leave late at night in working clothes before 3 separate incidents that got blamed on you. She heard him celebrate after them. She heard your name in the same sentence as holdouts. She'll put her name to all of it in writing. Boone's hands went still on his knees, not sharply, gradually the way a clock winds down when the spring finally goes. Thomas Lester is still in the county, Mae continued. His brother left. Thomas didn't. He's at the livery on the south end. What his brother told him before leaving about the lights he saw from the south bank, Thomas knows that account. He'll say it on record if someone asks him the right way. She waited 1 beat. Silas Crane passes through here monthly. Honest clerk, his own reasons to want Voss's affairs examined. I'm going to find him when he comes through. 3 copies of everything. 1 goes to Denver. Boone looked at the wall at the specific point that wasn't anything visible. Just the place his attention went when it was further than the mine. They used my name. Not loud. Not with the register of someone performing grief. The register of someone who had been alone with this knowledge for a long time, and was now saying it out loud to another person for the first time, while I was up on that mountain. After Rebecca. They used my name to take more from people who hadn't done anything to deserve what was already being done to them. Mae didn't move toward that with comfort or redirection. She let it be what it was. After a while he said, "You didn't ask how long I'd been on the mountain before I understood what Voss was actually doing. Tell me. First 6 months, I thought it was coincidence." He said it the way he said things he'd examined from every angle before speaking. Seventh month, a family named Pierce lost a grain supply, and Pruitt came up to ask if I'd seen anything. I hadn't. He filed it as unknown. Month later, Kellerman's fence line on the north branch, cattle scattered. Pruitt came again, started suggesting it could have been me. He paused. Kellerman sold to Voss the following week. Said the area had become too dangerous to work. Mae felt the shape of what was coming before he reached it. 6 months after that, Frank Lester's barn went up. Middle of the night. Lester came up to where I was camped the next morning and told me he'd seen men coming from the south. Not from the mountain. One of them wore a hat he recognized as belonging to one of Voss's riders. He left anyway. His wife was expecting. He said he couldn't risk staying. Boone's eyes came back to her face. But he told me what he saw before he went. No one believed him because by then everyone was already living inside the story Voss had made about you. By then I was the story. It's easier to believe a story you've already accepted than to look at who benefits from it being believed. Did you know it was staged? I suspected within the first year. When Pruitt's men came for me the third time in 8 months, I stopped suspecting. His jaw set briefly. I defended myself, same as the first 2 times. Same as 2 days ago. And this time one of them didn't come back. She didn't look away from that. He noticed she didn't. She said, "You couldn't have changed it from inside the situation you were in. Voss manufactured the mechanism that removed you from that land, and the mechanism worked because he had money and influence behind it, and you didn't. What followed from the removal is his accounting, not yours." He looked at her for a long time. The fire between them gave it small light. "You're the first person who said that without attaching something to the end of it." She understood what he meant without asking. The people who said things like that usually followed immediately with a turn toward the future, toward the part where it gets better. As though the acknowledgement were a doorway to walk through, rather than a place to stand in for a moment without hurrying. She let him stand in it. After a while he reached for the wooden horse on the ledge. Not to work it, it was finished. Just something for his hands while the rest of him was somewhere else. Rebecca named every horse in the county she could get close enough to observe them. He said it looking at the carving. Not random names, considered ones specific to each animal. The gray mare that Jake Merritt rode she'd called Duchess. Told Merritt the horse's name as though he simply hadn't known it yet. Merritt thought it was funny. She paused. Merritt thought most things were funny that other people took seriously. Rebecca knew which things deserved to be taken seriously, and she was usually right about it. Mae watched his hands on the wood, the way they held it, the same care he'd put into the carving, still present even now that the work was done. She was the steady one. Boone said it without being asked. In the camp that winter. I was the one coming apart, and she was the one managing each day of it. The water, the medicines we had available, everything that needed doing. She held the whole of it, and I don't think I told her enough times that I could see what it cost her. He set the horse back on the ledge, facing out. She went quiet in November. Not the way sick people go quiet. The other kind. The kind where you can see someone making a decision you can't reach in time to argue against. I understood it. That was the hardest part. Knowing her well enough to understand it and not being able to change the variables that had led her there. Mae said quietly, "The variables were Voss's to change, not yours." He looked at her across the fire. "I know that now." He said it the way you say something you've worked toward through a long stretch of dark. I didn't know it for about 2 years. She held his gaze. After a while he said, "When this is over, there's land north of the county line. Someone filed a claim on it and didn't follow through. Good soil. Water from a high source on granite." She waited. "I've been watching it from the ridge." He was looking at the fire, not at her. "I know how to work that kind of land, know how to build on it. But building something alone." He stopped. 3 years is long enough to know the difference between choosing solitude and just being there, because there was nowhere else to be. Mae looked at the fire. She thought about the thimble in her coat pocket, which she'd carried every day since the gate latch clicked behind her. She thought about what she'd said about the loop, about what happened when the variables themselves changed. Does it have south-facing ground? He looked at her. "For a garden. I'm particular about that." She held his gaze. "South-facing and sheltered enough from the late frost." "I won't build on land I haven't walked and assessed myself. The creek runs clean. I've been watching it 2 seasons. Granite bed, high source, nothing downstream contaminating it. I'll judge that when I see it. I know that." Something in his voice had shifted, not warmer exactly, but more direct. The sound of a man who has checked something twice before saying it. "I'm not looking for an arrangement. I'm looking for someone who argues with me about planting schedules." The corner of her mouth moved. "East-facing kitchen window," he said it. Rebecca always said morning light in a kitchen changed the whole character of it. She was right about that. East is a reasonable starting position. He nodded once, put the horse back on the ledge facing out. And for the first time in 3 years, Boone Garrett had the look of a man planning to go somewhere rather than a man enduring where he was. She went back down to Redstone Crossing the following evening, not the same route as before. She came in from the west this time, through the drainage cut behind the Methodist church, and found Silas Crane at the stopping post outside the feed store before he'd had a chance to arrange his accommodation for the night. He was older than his reputation suggested, spare in the way that years of movement produced in certain men. Everything unnecessary burned away until only what was essential remained. Quick hands. The hands of someone who had spent decades turning complicated human situations into formal language that would outlast the conversations that generated them. Mr. Crane. She kept her voice below the ambient noise of the street. Ruth Kinney sent word ahead. He looked at her sideways and continued with his equipment. She mentioned work, testimony, names, dates, specific events. Written in language a territorial court examiner won't be able to set aside on procedural grounds. He lifted his leather case from the wagon bed, set it on the ground, straightened. I'm particular about what I put my name adjacent to. Ruth told me. She met his eyes when he looked at her fully. Harlan Voss owes you wages from a job in 1874. He told you the work was unsatisfactory. It wasn't. He simply decided not to pay and knew you had no practical recourse at the time. Something behind Crane's expression adjusted without the expression itself changing. That debt may become collectible through legal proceedings. If someone presents a formal account of Voss's business practices to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver. She held his gaze steady. I have 2 witnesses willing to testify. Both saw things directly. I need someone to write it so it cannot be dismissed as informal complaint. The pause was shorter than she'd expected from a careful man. 3 copies. 1 goes to Denver, 1 stays with Ruth Kinney, 1 I retain. Payment is 3 months of whatever work you need when I pass through Redstone Crossing. And when Voss's legal situation becomes complicated, which the evidence suggests it will, I'll have standing to present the 1,874 debt to whatever proceedings follow. He looked up the street and then down it. Tonight after dark. He picked up his leather case and walked into the feed store without another word, which was Silas Crane's version of enthusiastic agreement. The document took 2 evenings. Agnes came first. She sat across from Crane at Ruth's kitchen table and recited dates, times, and descriptions with the organized precision of someone who had been arranging this information in her own mind for longer than she'd had anywhere to deliver it. Crane wrote without commentary, asked 4 clarifying questions. Agnes answered each without embellishment. When the testimony was complete, she signed her name in letters larger and more deliberate than Mae had anticipated, which said something about what it meant to Agnes to put her name to this particular truth after 15 years of keeping it. Thomas Lester came the second evening. Quiet man, carrying himself carefully in the measured way of someone who had been precise about what he said and where for a long time. He'd been in Redstone Crossing when his brother's barn burned. He'd heard the account directly before the family left the county. He'd carried it 8 months with nowhere to deliver it. He told it plainly. The direction of the lights from the south, not from the mountain. The organized movement of them too deliberate for a fire already spreading. His brother's certainty about the hat he'd recognized on one of the riders. The fact that he'd told Pruitt the following morning and watched Pruitt write it down and close his book. Crane asked, "Did Pruitt say anything when you told him?" Thomas looked at the table. He said he'd look into it. He had the expression of a man who'd already decided he wasn't going to. He raised his eyes. I know that expression. I've worn it myself when someone told me something I didn't want to act on. Crane wrote it down without judgment. When both testimonies were complete, Crane spent an hour organizing them into a single document with incident dates running in sequence, and those incidents mapped against the dates of Voss's subsequent land acquisitions. Laid out that way, the correlation was not subtle. 3 incidents, 3 purchases, the same 48-hour window between event and acquisition each time. He sealed 1 copy, addressed it in block letters to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver. There's an eastbound freight wagon leaving day after tomorrow. He handed it to Mae. I'll put it on personally and confirm it's accepted. She held the sealed copy, lighter than it should have been for something this large. This is documentation, not resolution. Crane said it the way he said things he needed to be understood clearly. Men like Voss have absorbed documentation before. He capped his ink. What makes it different this time is whether enough people are willing to be in the same room saying the same thing at the same moment. He looked at her steadily. You understand that. I understand it. Good. He began packing his case. The 1,874 wages. When the time comes, I'll need a formal filing. I know how to do that part. I know you do. Them. He closed the case with a small, precise click and walked out of Ruth's kitchen with the gait of a man who had recently become slightly less owed than when he arrived. Mae found Pruitt the following morning. She'd timed it deliberately, the narrow window between when the saloon closed and when he picked up his rounds, the one period in the day when Main Street held its breath. She found him at the water trough behind the deputy's office, checking his horse's near foreleg with the focus of a man who found animal problems more tractable than human ones. She stopped 6 feet away and waited until he looked up. He straightened slowly. Several calculations ran through his expression in quick sequence before it settled on something careful and not unfriendly. You've been keeping a log. She said it the way she said things she was certain of. Official record. Events you observed over the past year. Wrote them down and let them sit. Pruitt's hand came off the horse's leg. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the street in both directions. Who told you that? Ruth didn't give me details, just the fact of it. He turned back to the horse, adjusted the stirrup leather that didn't need adjusting. A man who keeps records he doesn't act on is preparing for the day when acting becomes possible. Mae kept her voice even. Or preparing for the day Voss decides he's more expensive than useful. Same instinct, different application. Either way, those records are going to matter to whoever comes from Denver after our filing lands. Pruitt's jaw moved, but he didn't speak right away. I'm not asking you to be brave before Friday. She said it directly. I'm asking you to know that the room is changing. The document in Denver is real. The witnesses are documented. And if you have records that show what you've observed in the past 14 months, those records will matter to the right people at the right time. He looked at the street for a long moment. I've been doing this a long time. He said it to the horse, not to her. Telling myself it was complicated, that the situation required patience. She waited. Mostly that entirely. No. Without judgment, not entirely. He picked up the reins. Don't do anything that gets you hurt before the council meeting. It was not an agreement and not a promise. It was a man who had been living inside a bad calculation for several years, beginning the slow work of finding his way out of it. And that was the most she could reasonably ask for right now, and she knew it. She walked back north through town the way she'd come, fast enough to look purposeful, slow enough not to look like she was leaving something behind. The climb back to the mine that evening had a different quality to it than the ones before. The cold was the same. The dark was the same. But the weight she was carrying up had shifted from the uncertainty of whether this would work to the cleaner problem of how to make it work well. Those were different kinds of weight. One was formless and the other had edges you could get hold of. Boone was at the mine entrance when she came over the last ridge. Standing, not sitting. Which meant he'd heard her coming from further than she'd expected. She saw him register the change in her before she said anything. Read it the way he read most things directly, without making a production of it. Crane sent the Denver copy on the morning wagon. It's gone. Agnes and Thomas Lester are both documented. 3 copies exist and only one of them is in this county. Boone absorbed this with the stillness of someone receiving information that has real weight, and Pruitt. Recalculating, she said it honestly, not all the way there yet, but recalculating. He nodded once. Looked north along the ridge toward the county line, toward the land he'd been watching from this elevation for 2 seasons. The council meets the first Friday of the month. Mae said it. That's the one time you can guarantee Voss and Pruitt are both in a room with every other person in the county. He looked at her. I stand up. I read the document in front of all of them. She held his gaze. Pruitt will try to remove me the moment I start. But if there are enough people in that room who've been waiting for a reason to stand up, and there are, I know this town then arresting me publicly confirms that something in that document is worth suppressing. It turns the act of silencing me into the evidence itself. And if Voss decides the arithmetic runs the other way, his voice was careful, working through a real scenario. If he decides the cost of you finishing is higher than the cost of what that looks like in public, that's why you're going to be there, she said it directly. Not to fight anyone, because you are the story he's been telling for 3 years. And when that story walks into the room on its own feet and stands quietly at the back, every person who has been accepting it on faith is going to have to reckon with what that means. Boone looked at the night sky for a moment. The stars were out in the numbers that altitude produced, more than you could count, more than the mind was designed to hold at once. She understood what she was asking. To walk into the room that had made him into something people told their children about. to stand in front of the people who had been repeating that story, to give Pruitt the clearest opportunity he'd ever had. I know what it costs. She said it because he deserved to hear that she knew. I'm not pretending it doesn't. It's not the cost I'm weighing them. He picked up the wooden horse from where he'd set it on a rock beside him. Reflex more than decision. Something for his hands when his mind was working at full load. It's whether it changes anything real. Whether Voss has enough law in his pocket that we make noise and he absorbs it, and the Creek families still lose their land, and my name stays the reason given for everything he takes next. I can't promise he falls them. She said it without softening. I can tell you that if we do nothing, those families lose their land permanently. Your name stays attached to every piece of it. And Rebecca's name is in the document Crane wrote. What happened to her, the dates, the sequence from the removal to the contaminated water to what followed. That exists now regardless of what happens on Friday. That part is already done. He turned the horse once in his hands, looked at it. The fire inside the mine gave its low sound. Outside, wind moved through the mountain in the long, slow way it had been doing since before anyone in the territory was counting. When is the council meeting? 4 days. He set the horse back down on the flat rock, 4 legs planted them. 4 days is enough time. She almost said something about what it cost him to say that. She stopped herself. He'd made his accounting and arrived at his answer, and naming the weight of the thing would only mean he had to carry the weight of the naming on top of the weight of the thing itself. Them. One more piece. Something Ruth told me. She said Pruitt has been keeping an official log. Events he observed, wrote down, and let sit because acting on them wasn't safe for him. A man who keeps records he doesn't act on is a man who knows a reckoning is coming and wants to be correctly positioned when it does. Them. She looked at him. I already talked to him this morning. He's not there yet, but he's moving. Boone was quiet for a moment, and if he goes straight to Voss with what you told him, then we move the meeting up to Wednesday and don't give Voss time to prepare. She met his eyes. I've thought about it. Them. He looked at her with the expression that had become, over these past days, something she could read more fully than she could have explained. Open in the way that open costs something. Offered anyway. You think better when you're moving. Yes. She said it without apology, and I've been moving a lot this week. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she could see the shape of where it would have landed them. They stood at the mine entrance for a while without speaking. The Colorado mountains held their ground in the dark the way they always held it, without effort, without announcement, with the complete indifference of things that have been doing it long enough to have stopped noticing there was anything difficult about it. Boone looked north again, toward the land above the county line, toward a south-facing slope and a creek on a granite bed and a kitchen window that should face east. We should go look at it after. He said it without preamble, the way he said things that were already decided. Before the ground freezes any harder. There are things I want your assessment of. My assessment. The soil, the water, the slope. He met her eyes. Them. You said you'd judge the creek yourself. I want you to judge all of it, because we're not breaking ground on something you haven't walked and approved. That's the most words you've said at once since I met you. The situation seemed to require them. She looked back at the horse on the rock, at the 4 legs planted on granite, at the neck lifted toward whatever was coming from outside. Spring. She said it to the dark and the mountains and the cold, clear air that smelled of coming frost. We break ground in spring. I'll need the frost dates for that elevation. I know them. I'll want to verify. He said nothing to that, which was its own kind of answer, and she understood it, and that was enough. They went back into the mine. The fire was still going. The horse stayed on the rock, facing out, watching the approach the way Boone had been watching approaches for 3 years. Except now there was something on the other side of it worth watching toward. 4 days, enough. They came into Redstone Crossing from the north end on a Wednesday evening. 1 day early, that was the point. Supper hour. Smoke from cook fires rising straight in the cold, still air. The particular quiet of a town winding down toward dark. The dog that slept in front of the harness shop had moved to the alley beside it, curled against the adobe where the day's warmth still held in the wall. A man crossing Main Street with an empty milk pail saw Boone first, stopped walking entirely, then remembered somewhere he needed to be, very quickly, and went there. Mae noticed the stopping and the quick remembering them. The body's involuntary response to a thing it has been told is impossible, standing in plain sight in the ordinary evening light. You could track the recognition moving through him like a current before his feet caught up to the decision to leave. Boone kept walking. His stride didn't adjust. The unhurried pace of a man who has finished making his decision and is no longer negotiating with himself about it. Beside her, he occupied the street differently than any other person she had walked beside them. Not because he demanded the space, because the space reorganized itself around him without being asked, the way water adjusts around a stone in the current, simply a fact of physics. She had the document inside her coat. 3 pages in Crane's careful hand. She'd spent the previous night going over the order again. Not the content, which she knew completely, the architecture of persuasion, them. You gave people the pattern before you asked them to believe the witnesses. You let the numbers establish the shape before you named who made the shape. You made the arithmetic so clear that by the time the testimony arrived, the testimony felt like confirmation rather than accusation. They reached Ruth's back door at 6:15. Ruth was there. Agnes too, them. Agnes was standing at the kitchen table with her coat already on, and her hands folded and the expression of a woman who had made her decision and arrived early, because arriving early was what you did when the deciding was done. He fired me last night. Agnes said it before Mae had fully cleared the doorway, no preamble, around 9 o'clock. Gave me a week's wages in an envelope and told me my services were no longer required. She met Mae's eyes directly. He doesn't know what's coming, them. But he knows something is. He's cutting loose anything that might complicate his position. Did he say anything specific? He said I should consider leaving the county. Agnes's chin lifted a fraction. He said it gently, which was more instructive than if he'd said it another way. Ruth set coffee on the table, them. The smell of it in the kitchen was the most ordinary thing Mae had encountered in a week, and she let it hold her for one breath, the specific gravity of something familiar when everything around it was moving fast. Town council meets at 7. Mae said it to the room, 50 minutes. Voss comes early. He uses the time before the meeting starts to remind people who holds the room. She looked at Boone. 2 of his hands are typically in town on Wednesday for supplies. They're hired to be seen, them. Boone said it quietly, organizing his thinking aloud, which she'd learned he did rarely enough that it was worth attending to when it happened. Presence as argument. They have no legal authority inside a public meeting. Mae said, Pruitt does. He'll try to remove me the moment I start reading them. And if he does it before I've gotten through enough of the document, the room won't have what it needs to make its own judgment about what it's watching. Then you need to get through enough of it fast, which is why the order matters. She put her hand flat against the document through the fabric of her coat. Land records and dates first. The pattern between incidents and acquisitions. By the time I reach the testimony, the arithmetic is already in the room. Even if Pruitt stops me after that, the room has the equation. Boone looked at her steadily. And if Voss decides the arithmetic is worth more than the spectacle of stopping you publicly, then he lets me finish and tries to discredit it afterward, which means the room gets everything. She met his eyes. Either way, we're ahead of where we were yesterday. Ruth came back into the kitchen. Word is sent. Holt Pierce will be in the 4th row right side before 7. Thomas Lester is coming directly from the livery. She checked the clock on the shelf, 22 minutes. Mae picked up her coffee and finished it in 2 swallows. Set the cup down. Looked at Agnes, at Boone, at Ruth. East door. She said it clearly. I go first through the fire door on the east wall. Boone comes in through the main entrance 30 seconds after I start reading. Agnes, you come through the east behind me and take the 3rd row right. When the time comes, you stand. Don't speak unless someone addresses you directly. Agnes nodded once. They went out into the cold Colorado evening and walked toward the lights of the council hall. The building was 3/4 full by the time Mae reached the east wall. She could see it through the gap where the fire door sat a half-inch off its frame, the warm lamplight inside, the rows of benches filling with the specific social geography of a small town that knows its own seating arrangements without being told them. Families she'd grown up watching, men she could name from 50 yards. Harlan Voss sat on the left side, 3 rows back. Not the front. The front would have been obvious. 3 rows back was close enough that the room oriented toward him without being directed to, the way iron filings find a magnet without understanding why. He was speaking to the man beside him with the relaxed attention of someone who considered tonight's proceedings a formality preceding an outcome he had already arranged. 2 of his hands stood along the west wall in the flat-brimmed hats that functioned as his signature at a distance. Wade Pruitt was at the main entrance, badge visible, weight forward slightly on the balls of his feet. The posture of a man who had been given a function, and was performing it and had not yet decided whether that function still served him. Holt Pierce was in the 4th row right, broad-shouldered, beard going gray faster than his hair. He sat the way a man sits when he has made up his mind to stay in his seat regardless of what comes at him. Thomas Lester had taken a position near the east wall itself, 6 rows back. He'd come straight from the livery. He nodded at Mae through the gap in the door without speaking, which communicated everything about what he understood he was there to do. Agnes was 2 steps behind Mae, waiting. Mae put her hand flat against the fire door and pushed. The door opened without drama. She walked in. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It never does. It went quiet from the edges first, the way fire goes out from the perimeter inward. People nearest the door, registering the thing happening and stopping what they were doing to watch it. And the silence spreading toward the center until the whole room was doing the same thing. 4 seconds, maybe 5. Mae walked up the center aisle with her pace even and her hands at her sides and the document in her right hand, and she did not look at Voss. She looked at the platform at the front of the room where the county recorder usually stood, and she walked toward it and she stepped up onto it. Arvin, the county recorder, had the expression of a man who had been surprised by his own job for 15 years and had not made peace with it. He started to stand. Ruth Kinney's voice came from the 3rd row left before he got upright. "Sit down, Arvin. Let her speak." Arvin sat down. Pruitt had begun moving up the right aisle. Not running, he wasn't careless enough for that. The deliberate pace of official purpose. And then the main entrance opened and Boone Garrett walked in. The second silence was different from the first. The first had been the attention you give to something unexpected. This was the attention you give to something that has reorganized the available space without asking permission. He was simply what he was. The full scale of him, present and unhurried, standing just inside the door with his hands at his sides, and his eyes moving through the room with the steady assessment she'd watched him apply to every new space since the night she'd found him on the rock. At that height, those shoulders, the kind of physical presence that didn't require performance because it was simply a fact of the room now, the way a mountain is a fact of a valley, and arguing with it was not a thing the room had vocabulary for. Not threatening, not performing. Just there, unavoidably, undeniably there. Pruitt stopped moving, not completely. His feet kept their position, but his forward momentum ceased in the specific way of a man whose calculation has been revised mid-step. He looked at Boone, looked at the room, looked at Voss. Voss's hands, Mae noticed from the platform, closed on his knees. She opened the document. "My name is Mae Calloway." She said it without raising her voice. The room was giving her everything it had. "I have lived in this county my whole life, and most of you know that. I have something to put in front of you that belongs to all of you, and I'm going to put it there now." Voss's voice came from the 3rd row, measured as a man reading figures from a ledger. "This is not the established process for council business, Miss Calloway. There are procedures for bringing matters before November 4th. Mae said it clean. Pierce out building fire. November 6th, 2 days later, the county land office records show a preliminary inquiry into acquiring Pierce water rights filed by one party. She looked up briefly, back to the page. December 17th, Kellerman fence line. North River branch. 3 sections destroyed. Cattle scattered. December 19th, Kellerman informs the county recorder of intention to vacate the property. She paused. Let it. The same interval, January 9th, Lester Barn, North Branch, total loss. January 11th, Harlan Voss files a formal expression of interest in acquiring the Lester water claim. She looked up at the room. Each time something happened on the river properties, Warren Voss was in a position to acquire something within 48 hours. 3 incidents, 3 acquisitions, the same 2-day window each time. The sound that moved through the room was not dramatic. It was the sound of people completing an equation they'd been given the components of separately and never assembled. The sound of arithmetic landing. Furthermore, Mae continued. On 3 separate nights prior to each of these incidents, witnesses observed men departing the Voss Ranch property after midnight in civilian clothing and carrying torches. Not from the mountain, not from Boulder Break. She found Agnes in the crowd briefly. From the south, from the direction of the Voss South pasture, Voss rose, unhurried. The controlled rise of a man who has commanded rooms before, and knows that the first move is to take the air out of the space before anyone else can breathe it. What this young woman is describing is the invention of a grievance. Her family owed me a legitimate debt. She was asked to leave the county. She is here because she has a personal interest in damaging my reputation, and she is using the name of a man who has the witnesses who observed those departures. Mae cut through it cleanly. Have provided sworn testimony to a licensed clerk. Their accounts have been formally recorded. 3 copies exist. 1 was delivered to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver 4 days ago. The room went to a different quality of silence. Pruitt had not resumed moving. He stood in the right aisle with his hand near his badge, and the specific stillness of a man whose procedures had run out of road and was waiting for instructions. Cole. Voss's voice had not changed in volume, but something in its register had shifted. The difference between a request and a reminder of what the request implied. Remove her from the platform. Pruitt looked at the room. He looked at Ruth Kinney standing in the third row left. He looked at Holt Pierce in the fourth row right, who had come to his feet without Mae seeing it happen. Simply standing now with the quiet inevitability of a large man who has decided where he is and what it means to be there. He looked at Thomas Lester near the east wall, upright and still. He looked at Agnes Dole in the third row right, who had stood at some point in the past 30 seconds, and was standing now with 2 extra inches of a woman who had been furniture for 15 years, and discovered something unexpected in the act of getting up. Other people were standing. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. The specific threshold of enough where remaining seated starts to feel like a declaration rather than a neutral position. Pruitt looked back at Voss. "I'm not going to do that, Harlan." His voice came out rougher than usual, the roughness of a muscle used for the first time in a considerable while. Not in front of all of this, the room heard it. Every person in it heard those 7 words and understood what they meant, not just the refusal, the name Harlan, not Mr. Voss, not Sir. The name of someone being addressed as an equal by a man who had not done so in years. 7 words, and the room knew what they cost and what they meant and would remember them. Voss's hands opened on his knees and closed again. Mae found the 3rd page. Boone Garrett and his wife Rebecca were removed from their property at the upper reach of Silver Creek on October 9th, 1875. She said the dates because the dates mattered, because dates were the opposite of rumor. The removal was initiated by a petition to the Territorial Land Office citing military land reorganization. That petition was signed by one party. She looked at the room, Harlan Voss. The room held its breath. Following removal, the Garrett family was placed in a government-organized camp 12 miles east. The camp's water source was a lower draw, contaminated. She found the name on the page. She had promised herself she would read it clearly, and she read it clearly. Rebecca Garrett passed in November of 1875. The examining man recorded the cause as fever. She paused. It was not fever. It was what happens to a person when they have been removed from every reason they had to continue, which is something that can be done to a person without ever touching them, and which is Harlan Voss's accounting, not Boone Garrett's. Total silence. The kind a room earns. The kind that only arrives when the thing being said is landing in the specific place in people where they have been pretending not to know something, and are finally given permission to stop the pretending. Boone walked up the center aisle. He walked the same way Mae had, pace even. Nothing performed. He stopped at the front of the room below the platform and turned to face the people rather than the platform. His voice was low. It filled the room without effort, the way his presence filled every space he stood in, simply because of what he was. I defended myself 3 times against men who came to me armed and with purpose. I did not come down from that mountain for 3 years because I had nothing left that required me to be anywhere. The land was gone. Rebecca was gone. And the men Voss sent up were not sent to bring me in. A beat, deliberate. They were sent to make certain I never stood in a room like this one and said what I'm saying now. He looked at the Voss, at the people. I'm saying it now. And Harlan Voss used my wife's name, and everything that happened to her, as the reason people should be afraid, while he used that fear to take their land. That is the true accounting of what has happened in this county for 12 years. Voss moved to a fence because it was the only option remaining. This man is killed. That fact stands regardless of what anyone reads aloud from a piece of paper. The reward I posted is lawful and it stands. Cole, I'm telling you, I already told you. Pruitt's voice was steadier this time, the steadiness of a muscle that has been used once and found it didn't break. I'm not doing that tonight. Voss looked at him. The look of a man recalibrating a resource he believed he controlled. You work for this county, Cole. You have an obligation. I work for this county. Pruitt said it clearly. Not for you. He straightened slightly. And I believe there are people in this room who have been waiting some time to hear someone say that. Several people sat down. More stood up. The room was in motion now, the specific motion of a collective thing rearranging its understanding of itself. Voss was watching it happen with the face of a man who has felt the ground shift beneath something he spent years building and is calculating rapidly how much of it is going to hold. The answer was becoming visible. It was not the answer he'd constructed. Mae folded the document, put it back inside her coat, stepped down from the platform. What came after was not orderly and was never going to be orderly. The room broke along the lines that rooms break along when a shared understanding has just been revised. People testing the new version against their own experience, against the things they'd noticed and set aside, against the small inconsistencies they'd explained away, because explaining away was easier than what the alternative required. She heard it in fragments as she came down from the platform. Voices she recognized running through the dates and comparing them to what they remembered about when Voss had appeared at certain properties. A woman in the second row saying to the woman beside her that she had always thought the timing was strange and had not said so because she hadn't known who to say it to. Holt Pierce still on his feet, speaking to Thomas Lester with the specific intensity of two men who have been carrying the same information separately and are discovering they can finally put it together. Voss had not left. Mae noticed that particularly. He was still in his seat, speaking to the man beside him with controlled quiet. The fact that he hadn't left meant he was still calculating, still looking for the version of this evening where he recovered the room, which meant he was not finished, which meant the next several days were going to require the same quality of attention she'd given to tonight. Agnes found Aunt Mae beside the east wall. He's going to work the room tonight. Agnes said it quietly, watching Voss across the moving crowd. Call in what he's owed. There are people here who owe him money, people who have benefited from his goodwill, people who are frightened of what happens if his version of this recovers. Don't assume tonight is the resolution. I don't. Good. Agnes looked at her hands. Those hands that had spent 15 years being invisible, then back at Mae. You read her name clearly. Mae held that for a moment. Yes. I heard him talk about the removal once. Agnes said it the way she said most things, quietly, with something underneath that didn't shift. He was pleased with himself about it. He used the word nuisance. Her jaw tightened for the first time Mae had seen it tighten. I have thought about that word for 3 years. I'm glad her name is now in a document that exists in Denver. Boone came to stand beside Mae, not close. The distance of someone who understood the room was still moving, and this was not the moment to make anything about the two of them. He looked at what remained of the evening. Voss still working his quiet countermoves. Pruitt at the entrance doing something complicated with his conscience. Neither of them said anything, which was also something. Then Pruitt walked over. He stopped 2 feet away, hands at his sides. He looked like a man who had recently put down a weight and was working out his posture without it. The testimony in Denver, he said it to Mae, already received and logged if the timing held. He looked at the floor briefly. I have a log, my official log, events I observed and recorded over the past 14 months, things I wrote down and let sit. He stopped, started again from a different angle. I've been keeping those records because some part of me knew the day was coming when they'd matter. I told myself it was professional diligence. His jaw worked. It wasn't entirely that. What else was it? He said it flat, honest, without dressing it. Insurance against the day Voss decided I'd become more expensive than useful. And because some part of me that I mostly managed to ignore knew that what I was participating in was. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. I'd like to give that log to whoever comes from Denver, along with 3 separate records of payments I received from Voss's land office, which I also kept. Mae held his gaze for a long moment. He was not a good man who had been corrupted at the edges. He was a man who had made a calculation a long time ago and had been living inside it ever since. Tonight the calculation had stopped being viable. That was not the same thing as redemption, but it produced something practically useful, which was what the situation required. Keep them safe between now and when the marshal's office responds to the Denver filing. Don't let anything happen to them. He nodded once and walked back toward the entrance. That was enough for tonight. The document was in Denver. The witnesses had spoken in front of 200 people. Pruitt had said 7 words in a room full of people who would remember them. And those 3 things taken together had changed the shape of something that could not be fully changed back. Voss was still there and still calculating. Mae was not naive about what that meant for the days ahead. But tonight was tonight. And tonight was enough. What Voss did in the following days was exactly what Agnes had predicted. Because 15 years of invisibility was 15 years of watching how a man operated when he believed no one was tallying them. He visited 4 families that first evening after the hall had emptied. Sat in parlors with the ease of someone who had sat in those parlors before and made himself comfortable there. Reminded people quietly of what he was owed and what the process of collecting it might look like if relationships became complicated. 2 of those families had stood up during the meeting. One of them stood again the following morning when his man came by, the standing having become overnight less frightening than the alternative. One did not, which was the cost of the arithmetic being different for people with different margins, and Mae understood it without excusing it. He put it about through intermediaries that Mae had manufactured the case from personal grievance, that the Calloway family debt was the source of it, that a girl with nothing to lose was a girl with nothing credible to offer them. This landed with some people and didn't land with others. The line between those two groups turned out to correspond fairly closely to the line between people who had personally dealt with Voss and people who had only heard about him from people who had. On Friday morning, Earl Calloway appeared at Ruth's back door. Mae saw him from the kitchen window before he knocked. He stood outside the door for a full minute, hat in his hands, with the posture of a man preparing himself for something he'd been putting off. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Not in the way of time passing, but in the way of something internal having shifted under sustained weight. She opened the door. He didn't come in immediately. "I heard what you said in that meeting." He managed it without quite looking at her directly. "I wasn't there. I heard from Caleb Merritt, who was, about the debt, about why I..." He stopped. "You don't need to explain it to me again." Mae said it without heat. "I understood it the morning it happened." He looked up. "That doesn't make it." "No." She leaned against the doorframe. "It doesn't. And I'm not going to stand here and let you give me an accounting of something I was present for. I know what happened, Papa. I know why you did it." She held his gaze. "And I know it wasn't only the debt. It was 12 years of being afraid of him. And one morning the fear got larger than everything else, including me. That's the truth of it, and both of us already know it, so you don't have to say it and I don't have to hear it again." Earl's eyes had gone red at the rims, and this time she knew exactly what it was. "Your mother is asking for you." He couldn't organize the rest of the sentence. "She hasn't been, since that morning." Mae was quiet for a moment. She looked past him at the yard, at the frost still on the dead grass in the shadow of the fence. "I'll come by. Not today. In a day or two." He nodded. Turned the hat over in his hands. "Go home, Papa." She said it without the anger she'd expected to find still sitting in the place where anger lives. The anger had been useful when it needed to be useful and had spent itself on something that mattered, and what remained was quieter and more permanent than anger. "Look after Dorothy. And when this is over, when Voss's situation is resolved and you're not under his pressure anymore, we'll work out what the land situation looks like." He stared at her. "You'd do that. Not for the debt." She straightened. "Because that land was there before he was, and it should still be there after. And because you are my father. For better and worse. That doesn't stop being true because of one morning." Earl Calloway put his hat back on his head and walked away across the yard, with a slightly different quality to his stride than when he'd arrived. Not lighter, but as though something had been correctly named, and the naming had allowed him to carry it in a way that fit better than before. Mae closed the door, stood in Ruth's kitchen with her hand still on the latch for a moment, then went to find Boone because there was still work to do. U.S. Marshal Frank Aldridge arrived on a Thursday, 6 days after the council meeting, which was faster than Mae had allowed herself to expect. Not a deputy. Not a letter. The marshal himself with 2 deputies and a leather satchel that had the weight of a great deal of organized paperwork in it. He checked into the boarding house and began his interviews before noon. He was a rangy man in his middle 50s with a gray mustache maintained with precision and the quality of movement that came from a career spent in rooms where reading people accurately was a matter of survival. He said little that wasn't a question. He wrote the answers with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that conclusions came after evidence was complete and not before. He met with the county recorder first. Then with Agnes, who sat across from him in Ruth's kitchen, and gave her account for the 3rd time with the same organized clarity she'd given it the first time, because the truth doesn't require management between tellings. Aldridge asked 7 questions. Agnes answered each one without elaboration. When he was finished, he looked at her steadily for a moment. Then, "Thank you, Miss Dole," which was a thing she had apparently not been told often enough that she received it without reaction. He met with Thomas Lester at the livery. He reviewed Pruitt's log in the deputy's office with Pruitt present, a meeting that lasted 2 hours, and from which Pruitt emerged looking like a man who had put down a weight and was working out what his posture was without it. Then Aldridge asked to meet Boone. Mae came with him. Not because Boone needed it. He'd walked into a room of 200 people 6 days ago and said what he had to say. She came because she had built this thing piece by piece, and she intended to be present when the last piece was placed. They met in the storage shed at the back of Ruth's property. Lantern from the center hook. 3 people in a small space. Aldridge in the chair Ruth had carried out. Boone and Mae on the workbench. Aldridge opened the satchel. Boone Garrett. He said the name the way a man says something he's been reading in documents for a week, and is now checking against the actual person. I've read everything Miss Calloway sent through Mr. Crane. I've spoken with the witnesses. I have Pruitt's records and 3 separate payment documents linking Voss's land office directly to Pruitt's account. He set his pen down. I have enough to proceed formally, but I want your account directly. Boone gave it, methodically, without embellishment. The same sequence he'd given Mae in the cabin 2 weeks ago, with dates where he had them and approximations where he didn't, and a clear distinction between the two. Aldridge listened without interrupting, wrote steadily. At the end he asked 4 questions, all of them aimed at the points where Voss's defense would try to create doubt. Boone answered each one precisely. When the questions were done, Aldridge set his pen on the satchel. The petition Voss filed in 1875 to initiate your removal. The territorial examiner we sent ahead of my arrival has reviewed it. The military land reorganization cited in it did not exist. The reorganization order it references was issued for a different district and a different year, and was altered before filing. He met Boone's eyes with the directness of a man delivering a formal finding. Your removal was unlawful. The land at Silver Creek was sold in the year following your removal, and the subsequent transactions are complicated to unwind legally. But the territorial court has authority to award compensatory damages for wrongful removal under false pretense, and the examiner's finding supports that claim fully. Boone said nothing for a moment. The families along the creek, Pierce's water rights are being restored. That process begins next week. Kellerman filed a formal reclamation through the county recorder's office this morning. Renaud is more complicated because the family left the county and will need to file in person. But the path is open, and the examiner's finding supports their claim as strongly as any of the others. And Voss. Aldridge's expression didn't shift, but the quality of what he said next was precise, in the way of a man being careful about the boundary between what he could confirm and what he couldn't. Warren Voss will be asked to answer formal charges of land fraud and conspiracy to deprive lawful settlers of property rights through manufactured threat. Pruitt will face charges for misconduct in office, reduced in exchange for full cooperation, which has been complete. He paused. Voss's lawyers are already in communication with my office. Men with resources have options in legal proceedings that men without resources don't have. I won't misrepresent that to you. He looked at Boone steadily. But his operation in this county is finished. His land holdings are under review by the territorial assessor. The families along that creek will not lose what remains of their claims. And my name, Boone stopped, chose the next words with care. Your name will not be attached to anything that happened in this county, except the account you just gave me, which is the account that will be in the record. Aldridge reached into the satchel and produced a single folded document, set it on the workbench between them. Your status as a free man in this territory has always been legally intact. You were never formally charged with anything, Pruitt having declined to file on each of the 3 incidents. This is the examiner's finding on the 1875 removal. It's yours to keep. He touched the document. It says in official language with the territorial seal that what was done to your family was unlawful. He met Boone's eyes. Sometimes that matters. Sometimes people need to have it in writing. Boone picked up the document, looked at it for a moment, folded it again along its existing creases and put it inside his coat. Aldridge stood, picked up his satchel, looked at Miss Calloway. What you built here was comprehensive. The sequencing of evidence, the witnesses you secured, the formal documentation through proper channels. That's not a common quality in a circumstance like this one. He said it the way he said everything, as assessment rather than praise. This county will be better for it. He went out into the afternoon. Mae and Boone sat in the shed for a moment, in the quiet of people who have just watched something finish that they'd been moving toward for 2 weeks. Not the dramatic quiet of completion. The more specific quiet of something real being confirmed as real. Boone took the folded document back out of his coat, held it in both hands. She said nothing. This was his moment, and it needed to be his without anyone managing the edges of it. After a while he said very quietly, Rebecca Garrett, in writing with a seal. He put it back, sat with his hands on his knees. I want to go to Silver Creek before we leave the county. I want to stand there once. Yes, that was all that needed to be said about it. That evening Voss was served with formal notice of charges at his ranch property by one of Aldridge's deputies. The deputy reported that Voss received the documents without visible response, which people who knew him said was characteristic, and which people who knew what the documents contained understood was not the same thing as the absence of response. By the following morning the word had through Redstone, crossing the way word always moved in a small town, faster than anyone planned and reaching everyone before noon. And the shape of it this time was different from the shape it had taken for 12 years, because this time it was not Voss's word. It was the territorial examiner's. It was the U.S. Marshals. It was Pruitt's official log and Agnes Dole's sworn testimony and Thomas Lester standing in a room saying what his brother had seen. And it was Mae Calloway on a platform with a document reading a name clearly. They walked to Silver Creek the next morning, cold, clear. The mountains showing their full scale in the winter light the way they only did in this season, the air clean enough to make the distances honest. The creek was partly iced at the edges where the current slowed, dark water moving under a skin of frost, the granite bed visible through it in the clear places. Mae pressed her boot into the soil at the bank. Deep and dark and giving in the way of ground that has been fed by clean water for longer than anyone in the territory has been counting. She'd judged the water source when she saw it, she'd told him that, and she was judging it now. The verdict was not complicated. Boone stood at the creek's edge and was quiet for a long time, and she let him be quiet because this required it, and she had learned by now when something required it and when it didn't. He took the wooden horse from his coat pocket, set it on the flat rock at the water's edge, 4 legs planted on the granite, neck lifted, facing the current. She looked at it there on the stone, the rough work of it. The way it looked now in the open winter light, still but present, left somewhere specific on purpose. He did not pick it up again. She understood this was the right place for it. Here where the water was clean and the light was clear. She understood without it being explained, the way she had understood most things about him by now, through attention rather than declaration. Rebecca would have named this creek something. Mae said it quietly. Boone looked at the water for a long moment. The corner of his mouth moved in the way she'd come to know, the thing that kept approaching a smile from new directions. Something that sounded important. She was particular about important sounding. Arrow or Swift. She liked the sound of Arrow. Arrow Creek, Mae said it. That's settled. Boone's voice had the specific quality of someone speaking about something that hurts and is also irreducibly something they love. Both of those at once and neither one canceling the other. She stood beside him and didn't say anything for a while. The water moved, the horse on the stone faced it. The mountains above Arrow Creek held their position against the winter sky with the complete patience of things that have been there long enough to know they'll still be there after. The land north, Boone said it after a while, looking toward the ridge. We should go look at it before the ground freezes any harder. There are things I want your assessment of before we decide anything. My assessment. The soil, the water, the slope toward the south. He met her eyes. You said you'd judge the creek yourself. I want you to judge all of it yourself because we're not breaking ground on something you haven't walked and approved. That's the most words you've said at once since I met you. The situation seemed to require them. She looked back at the creek. At the wooden horse on the stone which she was going to leave there, because this was where it belonged on Boone known that when he set it down and she knew it too. Spring. She said it to the water and the mountains and the cold clear air. We break ground in spring. I'll need the frost dates for that elevation, and I'll need to know whether the south slope catches enough light for the longer season crops. It does. I'll judge that for myself. I know you will. East-facing kitchen window, she said it. Already planned for it. He said it the way he said things he meant, directly, without decoration. Since before I knew there was a reason to plan for it. She looked at him sideways. You've been watching that land for 2 years. I just didn't have a reason to do anything about it. He held her gaze with the openness that cost him something each time and that he offered anyway, and that she had stopped pretending not to see. I have a reason now, Mae. She felt the full weight of the past 2 weeks settle and then ease, not resolve into something simple. Nothing that mattered was simple, but ease into the shape it was going to have, which was a shape she had chosen rather than one she'd been given. She was not the girl who had walked out a gate 2 weeks ago with a flour sack and nowhere to be. She was not the woman she would have been if she'd kept walking and left a wounded man to the rocks. She was something that had been built in the interval between those two things, from decisions she'd made one at a time, and it was hers in a way that nothing had been hers before. Spring, she said again. I have opinions about what goes in first. Strong opinions. I expected that too. They stood at Arrow Creek a while longer in the cold, clear winter light, with the wooden horse facing the current and the mountains holding their ground above them. And eventually they turned and walked north toward what came next, not away from anything, toward. That was the difference. And the difference was everything. 1 year later, in a house that faced the right direction and had a kitchen window that caught the morning light precisely as Rebecca had always said a kitchen window should, Mae stood at that window with her hands around a coffee cup and watched Boone at the fence line below them. He was working with the particular focused economy of a man who has found a use for his hands that means something to him. Each movement exact. Nothing wasted. She knew the sound of that work now the way she knew the sound of Arrow Creek below the house, which was always there and which she heard differently depending on whether she was listening for it. She was expecting their first child in the spring. They had talked about names with the care of people who understood that names carry weight, who knew from direct experience what it meant to have a name said clearly in a room when everything was against it being said at all. They had chosen names that honored people who deserved to be remembered in living rooms on ordinary mornings, by new voices learning what those names meant and finding that they meant something good. That was what they had decided. That was enough. Outside, Boone looked up from the fence line, looked at the window, at her. He raised one hand briefly, the uncomplicated gesture of a man acknowledging that someone he cares about is where he can see her. Arrow Creek ran clean below the house. The south-facing garden was mapped out in Mae's handwriting on paper pinned to the kitchen wall. Spring crops marked in order of planting date. Frost dates accounted for. The longer season crops positioned on the slope that caught the best light. She'd been right about that slope. She'd judged it for herself the first week they were on the land, and the judgment had been clear. Outside the window, the Colorado mountains were doing what they always did, holding their position against whatever the sky decided to bring at them, patient and permanent and entirely unimpressed by the difficulty of any of it. Mae finished her coffee. There was work to do, and she had always been better at working than waiting. The morning was clear and the ground would be workable soon, and she had decided exactly what was going in first. She set the cup down and went to do it.